September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay was gray and windless, a flat sheet of water carrying the weight of a signed surrender. Around the anchorage, the remnants of a navy that had once ranged from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean lay at moorings, scarred hulls, stripped masts, paint scoured by bomb blast and salt. American boarding parties fanned out from small craft to the ships that still floated: tugs, minesweepers, a few light cruisers, a handful of destroyers, and one battleship that every officer recognized by silhouette, even in peacetime quiet. Nagato, Admiral Yamamoto's former flagship, sat heavy at Yokosuka. Forward turrets trained dead ahead, armor plate blistered, upper works pocked by fragments. Her engines had not turned in earnest for months. She was still imposing, but the era of big gun sovereignty was over, and everyone on the inspection teams knew it. The orders to the boarding parties were procedural, not ceremonial. Secure the vessels, inventory what remained, render them incapable of combat. The process began the same way on each hull. Ammunition first, magazines opened, cordite canisters counted, shells tallied, and then winched to barges for disposal. Breech blocks came out next, massive machined steel wedges pulled from turrets and secondary batteries so no gun on any ship could be fired again without a machine shop, and time that no one would grant fire control tables and rangekeeper computers were unbolted and crated. Radio rooms were photographed before sets were tagged and removed. Radar arrays, air and surface search, crude by 1945 standards but still valuable to analysts, were mapped panel by panel. The intent wasn't punishment, it was process. The Allies weren't leaving armed hulls in Japanese harbors. The scene repeated at Kure, Sasebo, and Maizuru in the weeks that followed. Most of the great ships were already gone. Yamato and Musashi lay on the sea floor, one off Kyushu, one in the Sibuyan Sea, too deep and too shattered to tell any stories right away. Easy and Hyuga, hybrid battleship carriers by the end, had been wrecked in place under air attack and later finished off at Kure. Carriers that had survived to August, Katsuragi and Hosho among them, floated with flight decks scarred and hangars empty. Light cruiser Oyodo, designed as a scouting flag platform for long-range operations that never happened, rode high with little left aboard that suggested her intended role. Destroyers clustered in uneven lines, Hibiki, her hull still sound. Yukikaze, famous for returning from missions others did not. Auxiliary ships by the dozen with stripped fittings and crews thinned by demobilization. Inspection teams moved with checklists and cameras. Measurements were methodical. Armor thickness recorded at set stations along the belt. Riveted seams and welded joints photographed. Turbine casing serials copied into notebooks. Boiler tube metallurgy sampled. Where access allowed, engineers crawled into steering gear compartments and auxiliary machinery rooms to sketch linkages and note lubrication systems. The U.S. Navy's technical mission to Japan had one goal that went beyond disarmament: understand how these ships had been built and operated. Not to praise or to imitate wholesale, but to capture data at the source. Years of war had given each side strong views of the other's design philosophy. Now there were real hulls, real turbines, real plates to confirm or correct those impressions. What they found on the surviving ships matched the war's logic. Japanese naval architecture had chased speed, range, and offensive reach. At the expense of endurance, under repeated damage, machinery spaces were compact and efficient. But redundancy was thin. Damage control fittings existed, but were fewer than Allied practice, with less compartmentalization around critical runs of power and communications. Where wartime resource scarcity bit deepest was in late war construction and repair. Plate compositions varied. Welds on some post-1944 refits showed rushed workmanship. Spare parts interchangeability across classes was limited. Optics, however, drew universal respect. Rangefinders and night binoculars were superb, clear, bright, precise, evidence of a national industry that had specialized in glass and instrument grinding to a high standard. On radio and radar, the picture was mixed. Sets worked, but late-war Allied gear had outpaced them in raw performance and resistance to jamming. None of that changed the immediate task. Once the guns and radios were gone, the ships had to be marked. Hull numbers and Japanese names remained on many bows, but new identifiers, temporary Allied control codes, were painted large on superstructures and weather decks so that harbor control could track and direct movements during a period when hundreds of vessels, Allied and Japanese, were weaving through the same anchorages. Magnetic signatures were measured and, where necessary, reduced using deperming techniques to let hulls pass minefields safely. Minesweeping was still ongoing, and no one wanted to add an avoidable casualty to a ledger that was supposed to be closing. Crews, where present, stood by under Allied supervision. For some tasks, starting cold machinery, tracing steam lines, pointing out access hatches sealed by wartime improvisation, Japanese petty officers and engineers were the only people who knew the pathways under guard and orders. They did the work. Demobilization orders published ashore emptied the ships day by day. Sailors turned in rifles, then hammocks, then finally the brass tally plates from their berths as souvenirs with permission slips. By October, most of the larger hulls floated with skeleton caretaking crews whose job was to keep bilge pumps ready and lines tended while decisions were made about each ship's future. Those decisions fell into a few broad categories. Some vessels were obvious candidates for scrapping: war-damaged cruisers with twisted shafts, destroyers with fractured keelsons, auxiliaries whose hull plating had wasted thin. None had economic life left in a country that would need steel for bridges, rail, and civilian shipping. Some ships, however, presented immediate utility. Japan's people were scattered across an empire that had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians needed transport home from islands and occupied territories. Hulls that could sail safely at moderate speed were earmarked for repatriation duty. Guns were gone, but cargo winches still worked, and berthing could be improvised. Old carriers and large auxiliaries found new work not as symbols, but as platforms for moving people and supplies. Hosho, the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, would carry passengers instead of airplanes in the first months of peace. Other ships went onto lists not for use, but for study. Technical teams needed intact examples to answer specific questions. How main battery recoil systems were arranged on a Japanese capital ship. How high-pressure steam arrangements were routed in destroyer classes that had been built in large numbers. How fuel stowage and transfer had been handled for long-range operations across the Central Pacific. Those hulls were scheduled for towing to deep-water anchorages and eventually to test sites well away from busy harbors. The logic was unemotional. A ship was a source of data once. Once the data had been taken, it was steel. All of this unfolded at measured pace because the docks themselves were damaged. Kurei's yards had been pounded, cranes were down, machine shops roofless, power intermittent. Yokosuka was better. But even there, the electrical distribution had to be patched to run heavy equipment. Allied engineering battalions laid temporary power lines, brought in portable pumps and generators, and directed canvas over open shop floors so that work on decommissioned fittings could take place under cover. In the same spaces where hull plates had been rolled and riveted for fleets, grinders now cut through gun mounts and turret rings to free breech blocks for shipment to analysis labs. Questions emerged that no report could fully answer in a single visit. How had the interwar treaties shaped choices that cascaded into wartime vulnerabilities? Where did design skill end and material shortage begin in explaining failures? What could be reused now, not as weapons, but as assets to stabilize a defeated country? Those weren't rhetorical problems. They were line items. The occupying authorities needed steel for rails and ferries, small craft for fisheries and coastal trade, and engines for power. The fastest way to get there was to turn warships into raw material and salvage viable subassemblies. In that calculus, even famous names were just entries. Nagato, stripped of her instruments and with her big guns rendered inert, was a stable, towable mass of steel and engineering questions. Light cruiser Sakawa was another, decidedly less historic, but mechanically interesting as a late-war build with shortcuts visible to any trained eye. Destroyers that had survived by luck or by good handling were useful platforms for mine-sweeping conversions or pierside training in seamanship for a maritime workforce that would soon shift to civilian shipping. Mines still killed fishermen months after the surrender. The fastest way to make the sea safe was to put hulls and men to the task with whatever equipment could be adapted quickly. By winter, a rhythm had taken hold. Hulls slated for scrapping were lightened of removable machinery and towed to breakers, where work crews cut them down methodically. Superstructure first, funnels and masts next, then deck by deck, until only the armored citadels and heavy structure remained for long oxy-fuel torches. Vessels selected for temporary service were cleaned, marked, and assigned simple routes under Allied control, with Japanese crews under supervision moving people and supplies along coastlines still dotted with wrecks and debris. A smaller list of ships was set aside for something no one involved took lightly: controlled experiments that would answer questions about blast, shock, and survivability in a new weapons era. Nothing about the piers suggested drama. The photographs from that autumn show men in dungarees and white hats standing beside Japanese sailors in faded uniforms, talking over steam valves, pointing at junction boxes, tracing lines in grease pencil on plates to show where a cut would least endanger stability. The soundscape was ordinary industrial noise: winches, pumps, hammering on seized fasteners. A navy that had once fighted by doctrine and flag hoist now wound down by checklist. The answer to what happened to those mighty ships did not arrive in a single moment or a single decision. It took shape in paperwork and tow lines, in inventories and cutting schedules, in repurposed voyages carrying former soldiers to home ports instead of task forces to far seas. Some hulls would go quickly to furnaces. Some would serve briefly as ferries, store ships, or floating power before their turn with the scrappers. A few, chosen carefully, would be sent far from Japan to anchor a different kind of test. And beneath waters far from any harbor, the largest of all, the ships that had once defined reach and prestige remained where battle had put them, out of sight. Their stories paused until technology would be able to find them again. For the moment, the work was practical and unromantic. A fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting instrument. What remained were ships as structures, systems, and materials to be catalogued, used, or reprocessed. The men assigned to the task treated them that way. Properly, precisely, without flourish. They were not writing endings so much as arranging the conditions for whatever came next. A country that would have to rebuild its maritime life from the hull plates up, and a world already thinking about what steel ships meant in an era when the most decisive explosions glowed instead of flashed. By the start of 1946, the occupation authorities had moved beyond lists and inventories. The next phase was deliberate evaluation, technical, scientific, and final. The U.S. Navy's technical mission to Japan coordinated teams of engineers, ordnance specialists, and metallurgists who would document, then dispose of the remaining capital ships. The goal was twofold: gather every lesson that could be learned from Japanese construction and ensure that none of those ships could ever again threaten sea lanes or politics. The process started with the most famous survivor, Nagato. Once Admiral Yamamoto's flagship during the Pearl Harbor attack, she was the last Japanese battleship still afloat. Stripped of ammunition and optics, she was kept intact long enough to be towed across the Pacific. In March 1946, American crews lashed cables through her empty casemates and prepared her for the long haul to Bikini Atoll. She arrived battered but still regal, the lone representative of the Imperial Japanese Navy to participate in Operation Crossroads, the world's first peacetime nuclear weapons test. When the atomic cloud rose above Bikini in July 1946, Nagato sat moored among a ring of target ships, captured German cruisers, American destroyers, and other vessels slated for destruction. She survived the first blast, test able, though she was shaken and flooded. The second explosion, Test Baker, detonated underwater, lifted her bodily, and broke her keel. Days later, the old battleship rolled and sank, her final log entry marked by American hands. What had once been a flagship of expansion had become a test instrument for the atomic age. Not every ship made it that far. Many didn't leave Japanese waters. In the months after surrender, Allied Command organized a massive disposal effort known as Operation Road's End. Off the Goto Islands, a remote chain west of Kyushu, dozens of Japanese destroyers, submarines, and smaller craft were towed out and scuttled in deep water. Each sinking was recorded, coordinates charted for the record. Between April and August 1946, more than 100 hulls went down in these quiet ceremonies of closure. A parallel effort on the east coast near Yokosuka, Operation Dead End, finished the job for vessels too damaged to sail. Barges loaded with dynamite and shaped charges handled the task where towing was impractical. The photographs from those operations show the moment of ignition, a column of smoke, a brief boil of water, and then nothing but bubbles spreading across a calm sea. There was no triumph in it, just finality. Even as the scuttling proceeded, a handful of Japanese ships served one last practical purpose. The war had left millions of soldiers and civilians stranded across the Pacific. Repatriation was one of the occupation's largest logistical efforts, moving people from Korea, China, the Philippines, and the islands back to a homeland with little food or transport. Allied Command converted destroyers and small transports for this task. Guns were cut away, and cargo holds modified with wooden bunks. Old Imperial Navy sailors manned them under strict supervision. Steering along prescribed coastal routes, ships like the destroyer Hibiki and the cruiser Kashima made repeated runs between Japanese ports and the Asian mainland. Hibiki even carried Soviet inspection teams as part of post-war repatriation runs. By the time her last voyage ended, her logbooks read more like those of a ferry than a warship. It was a brief reprieve from destruction, but an essential one, moving hundreds of thousands of people home. Before fuel and machinery finally wore out, smaller ships faced different fates. Minesweepers and subchasers were in immediate demand because the seas around Japan were littered with uncharted mines. Every harbor, strait, and approach had to be cleared before any return to normal shipping could begin. Japanese crews, still in uniform, but now operating under Allied orders, took up the task. They used their own former Navy's minesweeping vessels and simple trawlers converted for the purpose. The work was dangerous. Mines didn't recognize surrender. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 300 Japanese sailors died while clearing waters around their own coastlines. Amid all this destruction and reuse, the Allied engineers kept testing. A few captured submarines were studied intensively, including the huge I-400 class, which had been designed to carry floatplane bombers for long-range missions against American cities. One was sent to Pearl Harbor for inspection, and later scuttled off Oahu when Soviet observers requested access that the U.S. refused to grant. Another was sunk near Hawaii with torpedo tests. The Allies learned everything they could: range, hull metallurgy, battery endurance, then sent them to the bottom. By 1947, nearly every major Japanese warship had been accounted for. The tall silhouettes of battleships no longer marked Kura's horizon. The seafloor around the home islands had become a graveyard of gray steel. What remained were auxiliary craft, small transports, and civilian-type vessels that could be rehabilitated. The once mighty fleet had been transformed into raw material for recovery. But amid the cutting and the sinkings, a few Allied officers saw something more than weapons being dismantled. The Kure and Yokosuka shipyards themselves were still assets, dry docks large enough to handle any hull afloat, cranes capable of lifting 250 tons, skilled engineers who had spent a decade mastering warship construction. The Allied Occupation Administration recognized that Japan's industrial rebirth would start there. Machinery was inspected, repaired, and in many cases left operational. Welding torches once used on destroyers would soon weld merchant hulls. At the same time, Japan's proud maritime workforce dispersed. Naval architects, draftsmen, and foremen found themselves unemployed or reassigned to salvage duty. In their notebooks, many sketched designs not of warships but of freighters and tankers, the kinds of ships the world would soon need to rebuild trade. The skills remained, even if the orders had changed. For the sailors who had once served aboard the great ships, the changes were harder to process. They watched Nagato vanish beneath Bikini's waves, read in newspapers that Kongo and Haruna had been turned into scrap, and heard rumors that the Yamato's wreck lay in darkness far below the sea. Some men salvaged brass plaques or nameplates before demolition. Others simply walked away. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist, not in battle, but through paperwork, towing cables, and cutting torches. The process of dismantling was nearly complete by 1948. Japan's coastline had become quieter. Harbors once crowded with gray steel now held fishing boats, barges, and the first small merchant hulls built after the war. The Allied administrators closed out their final reports, noting that no major combat vessel of the Imperial Navy remained serviceable. To the untrained eye, the story of Japan's warships ended there, in destruction and disposal. But beneath the surface of that bureaucratic conclusion lay the beginnings of something new. The yards that had dismantled the fleet were about to build again. The same engineers who had measured armor plate for its resistance to shells would soon test steel for cargo holds. The same drafting tables that once traced turrets would outline tankers. And before long, Japan would again launch ships, not to conquer, but to carry, marking a transformation as profound as any in its long maritime history. The next phase, reconstruction and rebirth, would begin quietly in those same yards, where the ghosts of the Imperial fleet still lingered in rivet lines and keel blocks. By 1948, for the first time in generations, Japan existed without a navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not been defeated on paper. It had been erased from the country's daily life. Under Allied occupation rules, Japan was forbidden from owning warships, forbidden from building them, and forbidden from training officers to command them. The idea was simple: remove the tools of war, and you remove the possibility of war. But even in those early years, occupation planners understood that Japan still needed a maritime workforce. It was a nation of islands. Food, coal, and raw materials had to move by sea, and so the same yards that had once launched battleships now faced a different kind of demand. At Kure, the giant dry docks that had once assembled Yamato were patched and repurposed. Welding torches cut away blast-damaged steel, but not to build gun turrets. This time, it was to clear space for merchant ships. Engineers who had calculated armor angles now measured cargo holds. Draftsmen who once drew torpedo mountings now drew lines for fishing boats, tugs, and freighters. Yokosuka, where destroyers and carriers had been fitted out for decades, shifted to repairing small civilian vessels first. Power was unreliable, machinery shops were damaged, and tools were scarce. But by 1947, the yards were active again, building steel trawlers, lighters, and barges, humble vessels, but essential for a country trying to feed and rebuild itself. At Mitsubishi Nagasaki, the same slipways that had produced heavy cruisers now laid the keels for tankers and passenger ships. Even during the strict occupation period, the Allies allowed this civilian rebuilding because Japan needed a functioning merchant fleet sooner than later. The workers who showed up each morning had the same hands and the same skills they had used during the war. The tools and rivet lines didn't care what kind of ship they were building, only that the steel was straight and the joints held. During these years, the transformation was slow but steady. Japan was still forbidden to have any military vessels, but the sea around Japan was still dangerous. Thousands of Allied and Japanese mines remained along key shipping lanes. To clear them, the occupation authorities formed a temporary force of Japanese sailors, strictly unarmed, who served under direct Allied control. Many of these men had served on wartime destroyers and knew how to handle rough seas and machinery. They operated small wooden minesweepers built quickly in old naval yards, and here, without fanfare, the first seeds of a new Japanese naval force appeared. It wasn't a navy. It wasn't allowed to call itself one. But it was the beginning of a maritime organization built on skill, discipline, and engineering, not on imperial ambition. Everything changed in 1950. When the Korean War broke out, the United States could no longer support a completely disarmed Japan. American warships needed safe harbors and secure coastal waters, and the U.S. recognized that Japan, even under strict peace rules, needed a way to defend its coastline from smugglers, mines, and infiltrators. So the occupation authorities approved something new. The Japan Maritime Safety Agency, a civilian coast guard, but staffed largely by former Navy sailors and engineers. It operated patrol boats, small escorts, and minesweepers, many built on hulls derived from wartime destroyer plans, simplified for post-war use. Some early vessels literally used recycled steel from scrapped cruisers. Naval architects, who had designed the Kagero and Yugumo destroyer classes, now designed compact patrol craft meant for rescue, inspection, and disaster response. By 1952, Japan regained sovereignty, and 4 years later, under American pressure to support regional security, the agency expanded again, this time forming the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. It had no battleships, no cruisers, no destroyers in the old sense, but it had Japanese-built frigates based on pre-war design principles, former U.S. escort ships transferred under new defense agreements, newly built minesweepers using wartime lessons to handle unexploded ordnance. The JMSDF's early training manuals were built on experience from the old Imperial Navy, but with one critical difference: every page emphasized defense, not domination. Search and rescue before attack planning, convoy protection before fleet operations, seamanship before firepower. The old mindset, speed, offense, range, faded. A new one appeared: safety, precision, reliability. And in the shipyards, something even more remarkable happened. As Japan rebuilt its merchant fleet throughout the 1950s, the world took notice. The techniques that Japanese shipbuilders had perfected during the war, tight tolerances, clean welding, Efficient layout of machinery, translated directly into commercial shipbuilding companies like Mitsubishi, Hitachi Zosen, and Kawasaki Heavy Industries modernized their docks. By the early 1960s, Japan became the world's most productive builder of commercial ships. Japan had lost its navy, but it had kept its shipbuilders. And those shipbuilders were now leading the world, not with weapons, but with peaceful industry. The story of the Imperial Navy didn't end with wrecks on the seabed. Its human legacy lived on in every keel laid in the new Japan. Merchant hulls, fishing boats, ferries, and finally, the sleek gray ships of the JMSDF that appeared by the end of the decade. This was the true turning point, when shipyards that once served empire instead laid the foundation for the most advanced, most efficient maritime industry on Earth. By the early 1960s, the last physical traces of the Imperial Japanese Navy had nearly vanished from Japan's coasts. But the story of those warships wasn't finished. The Pacific still held them, quiet, intact in places, broken in others, lying where fire, torpedoes, and scuttling charges had put them in 1944 and 1945. And as technology advanced, the graves of the Empire's largest ships began to reveal themselves again, one by one, from beneath thousands of feet of water. The first major rediscovery came in 1985, when a Japanese-led expedition located the wreck of Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Sonar technicians had searched the East China Sea for years, tracing faint echoes across silted seabeds until a long, hard line appeared on their scopes, far too regular to be natural rock. When remotely operated cameras descended, they found the bow section upright, massive and unmistakable. The triple 18-inch gun barbettes were still there, metal twisted and split from internal magazine detonations. The wreck sat in two major pieces, separated by the explosion that had lifted the ship out of the water. Engineers who studied the imagery noted details with quiet respect. The thickness of the armor belts, the structure of the ventilation trunks, the layout of the turrets. Decisions made in secret naval yards, now frozen forever in black water. In 2015, another discovery made headlines worldwide. A team led by ocean explorer Paul Allen located Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, in the Sibuyan Sea. The wreck lay at a depth of over 3,000 feet, resting on her starboard side. Her forward turrets were blown free. Gun barrels lay across the seabed like fallen columns. Her pagoda mast structure had collapsed. But even in ruin, the ship's scale was unmistakable. Engineers studying the footage commented that the weld seams on turret armor were still tight after 7 decades underwater, a sign of the craftsmanship that had gone into building the 2 largest battleships the world had ever seen. Other vessels were found in quieter circumstances. Furutaka-class cruisers appeared in surveys near the Solomons. Destroyers like Nowaki, Yamakaze, and Asashio were identified through scattered wreckage, recognizing turbine casing shapes or unique bow plating, and off the Goto Islands, divers documented the mass scuttling sites from Operation Road's End, finding destroyers and submarines lying in rows, exactly where U.S. records said they had been sunk. These wrecks weren't recovered. They weren't disturbed. For Japan, they weren't monuments to a lost empire. They were reminders of decisions, costs, and the scale of industrial effort directed into a war that could never be repeated. While the ships remained underwater, something far more visible was happening above sea level: Japan's transformation into the world leader in shipbuilding. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, yards at Kure, Nagasaki, Kobe, and Yokosuka were launching supertankers, container ships, research vessels, and ferries at a rate no other nation could match. The reason wasn't mysterious. The engineers who had once built cruisers and battleships, the draftsmen who understood hull stress, the riveters who knew how steel behaved, the metallurgists who knew how to balance strength with weight, were now applying their skill to peaceful industry. A merchant hull required reliability, not armor. A tanker required scale, not speed. A cargo ship required efficiency, not guns. But the underlying skills were identical: precision, discipline, clean lines, strong welds, correct tolerances. Japan's maritime industry rose from the same discipline that had once built the Imperial Navy's flagship vessels. By 1973, Japan was producing more than half of all commercial ships in the world, a dominance unmatched before or since. The same steel yards that had laid down Kongo and Nagato were now delivering oil carriers for Europe, bulk carriers for Australia, and container ships for the United States. Even as Japan grew into a maritime powerhouse, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force matured. Its ships, frigates, destroyers, and later advanced Aegis-equipped vessels were modern, compact, and built around defensive doctrine. Many ships were constructed in yards once used for Yamato's hull sections. The lineage wasn't political, it was technical. The hands that welded armor plate in 1941 were the same hands that welded merchant hulls in 1961 and then destroyer hulls in 1981. Japan returned to the sea not as an expansionist power, but as one of the most professional maritime forces in the world, focused on coastal defense, disaster relief, and alliance operations. Their ships were arguably the quietest, most precise, and most efficiently built in the Pacific. The mindset had changed. The tools had changed, but the craftsmanship, passed down through apprentices and foremen, survived intact. Today, the warships themselves rest where history put them. They are not forgotten, but they are not glorified either. They exist as study, as memory, and as markers of an age when nations believed the shape of steel could define their destiny. Japan learned a different lesson from their loss. Mastery is not in domination, but in discipline, in precision, in building well, whatever the purpose of the ship may be. Their legacy didn't vanish. It flowed into the world's finest shipyards, into the JMSDF's professionalism, into every hull Japan built after the war, commercial or military. The ships are gone, but the skill that created them lived on, and it reshaped Japan's place in the world. From a nation defined by battleships to a nation defined by craftsmanship. And out of curiosity, I would love to know, where are you guys watching from? Please subscribe to the channel if you liked the video. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. We'll see you tomorrow with the next one.